would like to take just a moment to put things into context of the community that we are privileged to call home. Now, a few days ago, we observed Memorial Day and paid a tribute to 29 of Foxborough's own, who, in answering the call to our nation, were asked to give their all up to and including their lives. And our heart goes out to them and their families. We also recognize veterans who had passed away since Memorial Day of last year. But now there was one other thing as part of that. Of those 29 people who lost their lives from Foxborough, there are memorial squares, 29 of them all around town. And Mr. Saban is in charge of them. And we do have volunteers who take care of the pots of flowers and stuff like that. But these are all in the neighborhoods as close to the serviceman's home as we could. And I have a list of all of them and their address that I'm going to leave over there. And just hopefully in your daily travels around town, you go by one of those, you might just have a word of hesitation and appreciation and prayer for families that have to go through something like that. So there's 28 men and 1 woman on those town squares. And it is a really, really, I think, a very, very nice recognition of trying to pay our respects. But now, then in a few days from now, we're going to be celebrating Founders Day. And that's rather familiar, that we've grown up with. But we have to remember that we're celebrating the birth of a new community formed by the families who would push to the very, very outer reaches of the towns they were living in. 4 separate towns coming out into the wilderness in this area that became Foxborough. They had to reach out to each other to survive. They depended on each other way out there. And you know, if a farmer cut down his hay, it had to dry in the sunlight. And if a rainstorm was developing while his hay was still on the ground, all the neighbors pitched in to help get it in the barn because he would go without hay and have to buy hay for the winter. So they had a sense of community that grew up among them. And I am so glad to say that that sense of community is still alive in Foxborough. And I think it's as strong as it ever has been. Now, you've heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, as a wordsmith, I wasn't going to let any photographer get away with that. But I have an image for you that I think is worth 100,000 words. Because that's how many words I would have saved if I didn't have to repeat this description so many times. Now, that image is taken from a great big map that was done in time for the Centennial in 1887. But they waited one more year, 1889, on this drawing. Now, we know that people had to, in order to first become a town, they had to set aside that central area here that we call the Common, but it's amazing that some of those families had come so far out into this area. And the citizens knew that in this sense of community that developed, even before they could request to become a town of their own. They had to build a meeting house and hire a minister and have services. Now, I mean, what do you do? All they are is groups of people with nothing to work with. Nobody owns anything much other than some land. So they had to ask for donations of land. So what in the world, where would it be? Now, there were 3 dirt roads converging in this area, and they made an appeal, and unbelievably, 3 families who had land all coming together in one area agreed to give up part of it. Now, stop and think. You could have plotted where all those 3 lots come together and put in a golden spike or set down a table and had 3 people having tea, each one from a different town at the same table. But there they were in that desperate situation, having 3 people, 3 families offer land. Now, Samuel Baker, this was his house right here. But he was a resident of Walpole. And here he is, ready to give up part of his front yard to be the common. Now, Mr. Henderson was on this corner. I want to get his name correct. Jeremiah Hartshorn, living on this corner right here. Now, School Street later came down here. This is South Street. He lived right here, and again, he's giving up part of his land right here. Now, his house was since moved around the corner, still part of it there. The brick building where Bay Colony Surveying is in right now. Now, Nehemiah Carpenter, all this land was Stoughtonham. And he lived way down here, the other side of Town Hall. And he gave the biggest part of this land. Now, he was a town officer in Stoughtonham. And he's living this far from his job. They had to go to the center of Stoughtonham every day to go to work. So what he did was he gave land toward the common, but also this burial lot. Now, he gave that burial lot because so many of the family cemeteries were getting filled up. So he gave that cemetery lot for this use and this use only. So he was very, very, very absolute about that. Now, when they agreed to provide land for the meeting house, they also agreed that if the new town was created, fine, they would give the land. If they didn't, they'd just take it back. Fine. Now, meanwhile, they've got the land. They've got to do something. So the residents purchased some lumber and built a meeting house. Now, when you consider that was quite an accomplishment for its day. Cutting the lumber, doing all the work, erecting that at their own cost, their own efforts. And they were determined to meet the requirements of being created as a town. So, the problem was, this land was kind of hanging in limbo then. He had turned it over to an entity that didn't exist yet because they hadn't been a town created. So there was other things that had to be done on the lot. So the donors of the land made out some paperwork that included some deeds that would turn the land over to the selectmen and there are signs forever. So it passed to those first elected later on, Josiah Pratt, Aaron Everett, and Nathan Plaque. And there were successes forever. So far so good, but much work still had to be done. The town couldn't pay for the work on the property because it didn't own it. The county had access to materials of interest, but it wasn't a municipal property. So residents who donated the money for the first meeting house were also called on to donate the money to do the first work on the lot. But over time, taxpayers were becoming hesitant. Here we are trying to make a living and get our families established in this new town, but we're paying money for a place to hold religious services and to hire a minister. And they were a little hesitant about that. The separation of church and state came early in Foxborough. The meeting house was torn down in 1822. Now, the Congregationalists who had been allowed to have meetings there, as well as the Baptists, they were, by the standards of that time, considered successors to the meeting house, so they were allowed to build a church on the common. And they agreed to build the auditorium somewhat larger than what they needed, so that the town could have some space for some meetings, but that they would do that. Now, the lot was graded in 1845. A single rail fence installed, trees set out, a cistern dug, all at a cost of $490, raised in donations ranging from $5 to $50. It was encouraging to see everything taking shape on the project, but every improvement, large or small, was a hurdle over stumbling blocks because it still wasn't officially town property. Finally, on May 19, 1853, the land was formally transferred from the 3 selectmen to the town of Foxborough. Now, I might add that 1853 was a year that many small straw hat shops were united into a single corporation called the Union Straw Works, which would drive their economy the remainder of the century. And in the first year of town ownership, the lot saw a planting of 30 elm trees at 40 cents each and 189 stone posts at 75 cents each to improve the old rail fence they had put up. In 1854, the Congregationalists moved the brick church and built the present church on Rock Hill Street. But it's interesting, just to give you the perspective. Well, when I have that map up again, I'll show you how eventually the Baptist church built a structure facing the common, and the Universalists built out the other end on Bird Street, and the Congregationalists built the present structure down on Rock Hill Street. So, but it was truly the impact of being there in the center of the village, where all streets seemed to lead at that time. So that year in 1857, it was a peak period of time when a group of citizens came forward and said to the town they wanted to do something about that old meeting house lot. Now, the meeting house had been taken down. There were expenditures time and time again to cut the bushes and trim this and do that. It was a mess. It was not appropriate for center town. They asked if they could please adorn the common, and it would be at no expense to the town. Now, given permission, they laid out and adorned the common much as we know it today. Now, when you look back, you see that triangular land, and just beyond it is that cemetery that Nehemiah Carpenter's land provided. They laid out the common, they had the walkway on the center, but there is all of the walkways just as they continue to exist today. And in the center, of course, they started building flagpoles and things like that over the years. But that was a major, major, major step forward. Now, in 1857, I mean, the economy was good. The town benefited from the expansion of the straw hat business, and they also erected their first municipal building. They built an enormous townhouse on the location of where our town hall is right now. That townhouse provided the first space for town offices and first place for community activities. And they predicted it was big enough to have 80 couples on the dance floor in that building for community events. So it was a classy building. Now, a private company leased some space in that building and started a high school. And they reserved a few of the seats for Foxborough students. But after the Civil War, the town added a school wing to that building, and that was the first Foxborough High School. Now, here we are. Here we are. We're ready. We're ready for a party. This is people showing up to celebrate the first century of Foxborough, 1878. They had that grand event on the common. There they are arriving by trolley. You can see so many people gathered. They had been planning on this for many, many, many months, and upgraded as they went along. They were so pleased with the number of dignitaries from around the state who wanted to come. And it was one of the most remarkable celebrations ever held in Foxborough. And their achievements were really richly deserving of the credits that they got. But making no effort to guess what we might look like 100 years later, they erected a simple stone called the Centennial Stone near the center of the lot, and then turned, took the microphone, and spoke to us. They said, "We greet you, children of a distant future. Across the century, we extend to you the hand of fellowship and congratulations." Wow. They went on to say that when their celebration was complete, many of their records and items of interest would be placed in a time capsule and buried there at the foot of the stone for the opening during our bicentennial, just as we did for those who were celebrating, will be celebrating Foxborough tricentennial in 2078. So you can imagine reading that, anyone that was interested in Foxborough history, and you're wondering, what in the world did they bury, and what kind of a treasure will it be? And just as a little child, walking through the common from Baker Street to kindergarten classes, I can't figure how many times I tried to get up on top of that stone. And I never made it. Some people later on offered me in a very adult form to help get up. And I thought, the number of broken bones, no, no, I'm not going to go. But as we were approaching our bicentennial, we began to get a little nervous about that. Just exactly where it was, how deep downtown, what. They began to poke in the ground with metal rods and around the stone, and not hearing anything, they got heavier rods, they dug a little, poked a little deeper, and they dug a few little holes. They're still turning up absolutely nothing. They get nervous. So they even went so far as to have the town lift up the Centennial Stone. There's the mark where it was above ground, and they were standing up there. They actually picked that stone up and moved it. But I was so nervous because if the machinery put a big scratch on there, I mean, we got to put that stone back after we searched and hopefully retrieved the items they buried. So we treated it with great care. But we went from poking to digging and then getting big equipment up there and digging holes. And if you can believe it, they dug a hole. It was about 12 feet deep. And as big as the span of your hands. And we're still empty. And I had all kinds of plans that have wondering what we got. The men on the Highway and Tree and Top Park Department got quite taken with how anxious I was and how disappointed we weren't getting anything. They did find something. So what they did is they went out and got an old piece of wood that was probably 50 or 60 years old. They cut it in the shape of a shield. And on there they mounted the hip bone of a cow that had been buried on the common many decades earlier. And they presented me with that. So you can imagine how the children visiting Memorial Hall enjoyed that story every time about that hip bone. But it was just an incredible experience. But we did, in fact, come up empty after all that time. So we had to face that reality and admit that. But then I'm still wondering, I'm still doing research, because they said they were going to do it. Now, usually if a committee had changed its mind, there would have been some statement made of it. So I got their minutes of all their planning and execution, and I even followed the minutes of their meetings after the Centennial. And I'm looking and looking and looking. And finally, months later, nondescript, right in the middle of another paragraph, no headline, no big announcement, they had a self-congratulatory pat on the back, saying what a good decision they made when they decided not to bury such important pieces of paper in the ground. Now, I must admit, I don't know what conditions were about burying paper underground in those days, but certainly it was probably best not to put anything too valuable under the ground. So we came up with absolutely nothing. But I still live in hope that someday somebody is going to find an old trunk up in an attic somewhere, or some boxes stored in a barn somewhere, and they wonder what it is. And they open it up and they find some things from Foxborough's bicentennial, or centennial. I'm wondering, will they turn it over to us? Or will we see it for sale on Google? Would they consider reimbursing us for all the time spent trying to find out what they promised to bury and never did? There was a lot of money spent. But the disappointment was more than the money. Now, I would also like to talk to you a bit about the value of land and what we can do with it. Now, from the very, very beginning of time, land in what became Foxborough was highly valued and originally negotiated and purchased from the Native Americans. Every bit of it was purchased. But our town was formed on land taken from other communities. I mean, a whole big chunk of Stoughtonham, which is now Shannon, all of a sudden there was a boundary line, and all those people are no longer Stoughtonham. And the same with Walpole and all these other towns. Big chunks of that town of taxable property, of great homes, people living there, going about their everyday life, but all of a sudden they belong to a different town. Some of them did not like that. They did get permission to retain their address, so to speak, and their residency in the prior town. But, so we get all of this land from Rentham, Walpole, Stoughton, and Stoughtonham. It's now ours to tax and build a new town upon. So we had a long way to go. I mean, we didn't have so much as a rented room for the town at that time. So slowly it grew. We developed industry of international importance. We learned to exist based on the taxes paid by residents and the business community. But as this continues up into modern times, there was a constant problem with higher taxes. I mean, it was inevitable. Towns grow, your needs grow, and especially when Foxborough doubled in size after World War II. Good grief. Everything we owned was strained. Every school, every building. Now, when I told you the town offices were in that townhouse, that townhouse burned down in 1900. And the school was lost. All town offices lost their space. They built another school, a high school, wooden frame high school on that site. They never built any more space for town offices. Now this is 1900. They never built any more space for town offices until the 1960s. But, now, but slowly we grew. But the constant problem, as I say, with the higher taxes, that's the one thing we would be guaranteed of. But they had an opportunity, the idea spread, something they had tried out in California, a program that they called Proposition 2.5. What they did was they would determine the value of all the buildings in town and write that value down and say taxes will not be more than 2.5% of this figure. So all residents had the assurance of knowing that the value of property might go up a little bit, but that 2.5% will still hold. Now, everything was then limited to that amount of money. But if you had to do something big, like a new school or something like that, you could then go to the state and get permission to exceed the 2.5% on a particular loan. But that had to be approved at a meeting and then go to town meeting to make sure the decision was made by the broadest base of people. So every year, if you think back over the past 10, 15 years, every year you'd see articles in the paper, all the towns around us, about towns going for special loans over and above Prop 2.5 for projects in their town. And a lot of people were kind of shocked. They referred to sleepy little Foxborough. They never asked for one. Oh, what's this? Well, we never asked for one because we didn't need one. We had something different. Now, way back, over time, there was a situation come up where there was an effort to bring the Boston Patriots to a home. And an offer was made of a stadium and a land and so forth in Foxborough. And the agreement was that if it was approved, they would give the land to the town of Foxborough. They would then contract, let somebody build a stadium, and their income would come through ticket sales. Now, that was a little unusual, but you know, you rent out, you get income. So ticket sales, I think it was only 25 cents a ticket when they started. But that money continued to grow. But when they adopted Prop 2.5, and they valued all the property, they did not consider income from that football stadium to be taxes. They called it rent. As rent, it wasn't limited by 2.5. So we could have hundreds of thousands of dollars come in through rent that didn't affect our tax rate at all, and we had that money to spend. Now, it's just, I mean, can you imagine the number of towns that would like to have an arrangement like that? And but we did. We've had people say, what's the matter with Foxborough? And we just be so proud to say, nothing's the matter with Foxborough. We're 10 years ahead of you because we've got all this money coming in. So over time, of course, the stadium, new stadium built and even more events held there, and our income went up. But then adjacent to that, all this land of Patriots Place. Now, there was a time when that land on Route 1 was of such low value, most people just let it go, not paying their taxes, and the town took it over. But I used to say that land was so rocky and hilly and everything, it wasn't fit to graze goats on. But then I figured that's an insult to the goats. But mankind was not making any interest in that. So now they turned it into Patriots Place, and my goodness, the tax money involved there is, again, a great benefit to the town. And all of the benefits of our getting all that money over and above taxes all these years has benefited us in so many ways. And I think you will find it's going to be a big part of our new senior center as well. Right? Now, I have one other item to share with you. Now, these are things like when we talk about all this land and the values, all that went on, but all the changes and all that was passed to us that we built on, and now we pass to the future. But over the years, in the Reporter, I had written so many stories about men and women who have done such extraordinary things in Foxborough. All kinds of things for business and for churches and schools and whatever. A lot of wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people that reached out to their neighbors and cared for one another. And so many of these were women who, coming to a new town, well, some were natives born, but others, imagine the number of women who husband happened to take a job at the Foxborough company. They end up in a new community. What is this place? They begin to look around and they see things that Foxborough was lacking that they thought they could help about. And they started working with the community on different things. And I finally got to the point where I thought we should really do something special for these people. So I wrote up a proposal and threw out a quick list of 30-some odd names and presented it to the Historical Commission. And my goodness, they thought it was a great idea. And all of a sudden, here we are making space in Memorial Hall for a new display. And we're writing, taking people off this list, and we had a lot of material about them to write from, different stories I'd written over the years. So different members were volunteering to take names and do the write-ups. We had to limit to a certain number of words for space, but then Deb Wendell, who's back there at the camera, agreed to format all of these so we would have a picture of the individual, a highlight of what they did, and then all this verbiage about what they did for the town. So we have in Memorial Hall right now that display. Now that's just two panels of, there's many panels to flip, and that is the start of our Women of Foxborough display. Now let me just give you a slight idea of some of the people who were there. Jackie O'Reilly, pharmacist. Daughters got involved in ballet, got lessons. They realized other families couldn't afford that. Jackie did something about it. Today, every city and town in Massachusetts has a cultural council funded by the state lottery. All because of her work. Now, in all of these people, I just highlight some of their contribution, but any one of these people also, they were very active in their church and other community things, all through school, whatever school they were in, the parents were there to help, and all through high school sports, everything, they contributed so much. Elma Conway, West Foxborough Mothers Club, Everett School supporter. They cleared the beach and hired a lifeguard at Lakeview, the first safe swimming area for Foxborough children. Robert Johns had a child with special needs. Soon she realized there was other families. Soon they had meetings with each other, so that what one learned about helping children, the other could help, and pretty soon they started efforts on state legislation and classes in school that would recognize their needs. Priscilla Bartlett, child care nurse. Oh, when World War II broke out, she went back to the classroom, got certified in rehabilitation, and spent the rest of her life helping veterans. Joan Sozio, certified in water preservation and purification. The first job she ever took was in the town of Foxborough, and she also served on, her job was on water purification, but she served on the town's committee the rest of her working life before she stepped down. Dory Manning Marceau, a child with special needs, was at her knees. Soon she was helping local families, and they expanded their efforts, and now they urged the state to create programs and classes in schools, and it's a standard now in education everywhere. Hazel Bourne, part of a mother-daughter combo in World War II, both her and her daughter serving. She helped form the Conservation Commission and led many, many state efforts. Peg Bradner, retired librarian, spent decades indexing local papers, and we've now expanded that we can go back over the years at the convenience of a keyboard and pull stories out from 10, 15, or 115 years ago and print them out. Emily Bonner, who proposed the Historic House Plaque program. She researches the full history of the house and the family living there for the owners. And then they get a plaque to mount on the house. And she's done that for more than 245 homeowners in Foxborough. Deb Wendell volunteered on her own to take programs filmed by cable, formal programs at the library or other places, or events at schools, or sporting events, or parades and special occasions, and put them all into an index that is available on your computer. And you can go back to any of those programs anytime. Now, so many times I've had calls from former residents who would give anything to come back to Foxborough for a visit, but they just don't have the means. They're not healthy enough, they can't get there, no family to bring them, whatever. I refer them to Deb's Index, and they can go back and run a cable program on any subject they choose. And all of that is available, and it's amazing. Now, this Women of Foxborough exhibit is now on display with the first number of names that we have written up. We are still working on more, and that index is going to continue to grow. Number one, as we're writing up more people from the past, but every day we have more people out there now doing things worthy of recognition. So this type of exhibit is going to be with us for a very, very long time. Now, Memorial Hall isn't the easiest place to get into. So what I've done, I've spoken to the Historical Commission, and they are willing, and they're going to try and work out something whereby we can work out something with the senior center here to transfer, to bring people up to Memorial Hall, help them in the hall, view all the exhibits, and we give you a ride back home to this place. So that is on the calendar for announcing soon, and it will be a great day when we can get a broader audience into Memorial Hall and have you enjoy this. Now, all of this has, it's been a joy for me to present. I mean, you're just the greatest group of people. And if you have any questions or anything, I'd be glad to answer them. But I also, yes, sir.
Over by Rock Hill Cemetery, there's Copper Memorial. Is that just a chapel, or what's the story with that building?
Excuse me, at Rock Hill Cemetery, what?
Yes, sir. When you go into Rock Hill Cemetery, there's a chapel as you enter.
Yeah.
And it says Carpenter Memorial.
Yes.
What is the story? What is in that building?
Well, that's offices of the cemetery. There's also a place in there to have services. Some family has had memorial services there over the years. So it was all part of the part of the planning of the cemetery, and it was named for the Carpenters because of their involvement in the cemetery. Now, if you remember, when I showed you, I showed you how Nehemiah Carpenter gave so much land for the common,
Right.
but he also gave land for the cemetery and said, for that purpose only. Now, wait a minute, Memorial Hall is sitting there now. How did that happen? E.P. Carpenter, who was chairman of the committee to build erect a tablet for those who served in the Civil War. And his committee decided they didn't want just a slab of granite with some names on it. They wanted a different type of memorial whereby veterans would be able to meet and store their records. And if the town ever did decide to start a public library, that would be a good place for it for the veterans and their families and generations to follow. The town voted that because here is the grandfather of the grandson of Nehemiah Carpenter leading this committee. And I'm sure he felt he could take leeway with his grandfather's edict that there'd be nothing there but burials. And how appropriate, he was also the lead creator of Rock Hill Cemetery. And the ladies of the Straw Hat Factory did two things. Number one, in the memorial hall that was getting built, ladies raised some money to pay for the design and creation of that big lantern over the front door. And when the owner of the business they worked for was starting this new cemetery, the ladies paid for the gate into the cemetery, which at that time was at the foot of Rock Hill Street. The gate that's there now hadn't been built yet. It hadn't been expanded out that way. But those ladies played a role in that. Because the straw hat industry, it did wonders for the town. But for women, for many of them, it was their first chance to have an income of their own. And this made them a political and social and economic force in the community. And they did wonders helping things like this. Now, when we had that lamp over the door, it had Civil War motif in all of the glass work. So, of course, when they did start a library, that's where it was started. And so somebody thought, gee, we got to take out one of those glass panels and put in one that says Boyden Library. So that was done. So many, many years later, of course, the library's moved now. And that Boyden Library glass was inappropriate. So we found somebody who could recreate one of the glass memorials of Windows Forest. And when it was ready, they called and said, pick it up. And it was all the way in Boston, and the only one that had any time available that day to go to Boston and pick it up was poor Dave Bragg. He was the library trustee and commission member as well. But Dave drove all the way to Boston and picked up that glass, and he's got it sitting on the seat of his car. All of a sudden, he gets caught in the traffic, and he had to jam on the brakes. The glass slid off and gone. So, here we got to get another one made. And we'll have 2 or 3 people in the car, and we'll pick it up and bring it home safely. We got it up there. So, sometime after that, when we were getting together for a commission meeting, Bob Brown walked in and he had something strange in his hand. So when the time came, he said how we were cleaning out a desk way over in the corner of the library. And we found something in the bottom of the drawer. And we took it out, and there it was, wrapped in brown paper. The original Civil War painted glass that they took out. So, it was a lot of laugh on that one. Poor Dave, he never got over that. But the interesting thing, when Boyd Library in that building, it got so cramped, and 2 wings were put on for more space, and still it's filling up, and it was really very, very difficult. In the meantime, the society had fallen on bad terms, and that phased out for a while. So a lot of their artifacts were stored in Dave Brake's barn again. And so they agreed that a new library would be built, and they had the greatest line of people you ever saw, stretching from Memorial Hall over to the library, passing books to each other, all the way across the common to get into the library. Now, the thought had come up, now they're going to vacate Memorial Hall. What are we going to do with it? If you believe it, that same year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts created a new office for towns. They were able to create historical commissions. Everybody had had a historical society forever, but now there was an official town body created, historical commissions. So we grabbed that in a heartbeat, and the day it was formed, we filed to turn Memorial Hall into a town archive and museum. And we had all those items in Dave Brake's barn to carry down. So overnight, here we are building a collection. And we just had the grandest time. Now, all due respect, the Brake family never threw anything away, so it took months to go through the garage and all of that. But we were doing it, and we were in there every day, every night, every weekend, whatever time we had. And it dawned on me. I said, hey, wait a minute, guys. We don't have to whisper. This isn't a library anymore. We're all going on. So we had the library. But then, just another little aside, when I interviewed one of the white soldiers from the white family in South Foxborough, he served in late in World War I and then first in line in World War II. When he was coming ashore on D-Day, their landing craft got hit by a shell and sunk to the ground. Now, fortunately, they survived this hit. But his personal bag of all his belongings went down to the bottom of the English Channel. Now, here he was. His life was risked by this, and he's in the middle of a war. But he is upset, so mad against the Germans, because in that double bag was his pin-up picture of Zazu Pitts. Now, I confess, I didn't know who Zazu Pitts was. But his passion, even after all those years, his fury, that they would take that picture away from him. So I said to Marge, I said, we got to do something here. Now, when we opened up the museum, one of the gifts we got was the original projector from the movie house that showed the silent films. And with that, we got several boxes of slides to show previews of coming attractions. So there we are on a Sunday afternoon. Marge and I are sitting on the floor up at Memorial Hall, and we've got these stacks of slides in front of us, and we're looking, and we're looking, and we're looking, and suddenly I let out a shout, "There's Zazu." So I went to the Foxborough Company photo department, and we got a picture of Zazu. I took it down to Chet's house. There was a tar paper shack at the time, and he went crazy. Now, he hung it up on the wall just as you step in the door. And that hung there every day for the rest of his life. And I'm saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. But those are some of the things that we have of interest. I meant to mention when I showed a picture of the town squares, that particular square was Mr. Ouimet from Foxborough. He took off from the aircraft carrier Wasp on a mission out in the Pacific. Never heard from him again. No trace of the plane, nothing. And so he eventually declared killed in action, and so he became our first casualty in World War II. So what I wondered, I mean, it's 12:10. The time is yours, but you have some questions, yes.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I'm sure you could talk for weeks on various topics. I'm just interested if any Native American artifacts have been found.
Native American
Native American artifacts have been found in town?
Yes. Yes, we have a display at Memorial Hall. Okay. And then some in boxes and stuff, but a lot too. A lot were found here, but others were collections that people had, and some Foxborough people bought collections from other people. But we had a lot found here in Foxborough, a lot of them around Lake Miramichi, and also the Ponset Lake. I was out on, as a kid, my father rented a boat, and we went out to Blueberry Island in the Ponset, and we were going to have a cookout. Seafood. Well, it never took so long to get water to boil. But so my brother and I are looking around the island and picking up odd pieces of wood, and the water was quite low. And I looked, and just offshore between the island and the mainland was this large rock, and I mean, it was probably 3 times, well, at least twice the size of this, and about that high. And surprisingly flat surface for a natural rock. But all around the base of that rock were chips of flint, where the Native Americans stood there and used that as a work base, and cut their arrowheads and their axe heads and all of those things. And we have some of those arrowheads and axe heads on display in Memorial Hall. Yeah, we're very, very fortunate that way.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if any of you, in your travels around, went into places, and when people realized you were from Foxborough, they had unusual responses to that. Anyone? Anything unusual? Yes.
When I was a boy, my mother said if I didn't behave myself, I'd end up in Foxborough. So that was Foxborough from Rockland.
Oh, let me just give you a couple. I was I was one of 4 American editors asked to go to India to do newspaper programs. It seemed every newspaper in India would try to be all India. Nobody was telling them what happened in their town and around town. So 2 of us brought our wives over, so Marge and I were there, and it was interesting beyond belief, but she was not feeling well, so I finally made arrangements to take her to the doctor, and we went in, and he looked at the paperwork and said, "What part of the state are you from?" I said, "Massachusetts." "Well, what part of Massachusetts?" I'm saying to myself, she's sick, for goodness sake, listen to me. I'm from Foxborough. Foxborough? I went there every Wednesday night. Excuse me? He interned at Beth Israel in Boston. And they had every Wednesday night off. So they came out to the racetracks at Beth Israel. Another time we were in Alaska, and all the museums and everything, but one chance was to go to a school where they were training dogs for the Iditarod races. I thought that would be nice to see. So we went in. Oh, where are you from? Massachusetts. Whereabouts? Foxborough. The guy snapped his head right back. Foxborough. And he gave me the date and said, "I was in Foxborough that night because so-and-so was performing at the stadium." Now, he mentioned this oddball performer that I never would have heard. And I said, "You're not going to believe this, but that performer is at the stadium tonight. And that is why I'm in Alaska." Yeah. Oh, we had a lot of fun with it, but it is a great place. But in addition to the Women of Foxborough exhibit that I said Deb worked on, and all of that is the, and that treasure of filmed pieces. And now our archives have been expanded with greater capability so that we can go back in time to print out stories, but also all during World War II, our Foxborough sent out letters to all the servicemen and women around the world. VTY, very truly yours. And so many of them wrote back saying, every person in my unit wishes their town did the same thing. But there it was, all what's happening in town while they were away. So they wouldn't be total strangers when they came home. And I finally got together a copy of each one of those letters, and we have them all filmed and at Memorial Hall, and people can go back and look to see any members of their family had written back. Also, the Foxborough Company had a monthly publication that also included articles about individual employees. Maybe somebody got a 40-year pin or did this or did that. And we have scanned all copies of those. They are on file. And it's just such a world of things out there that we can do to go back into the future to give us much more energy as we take this proud history and pass it on to the generations that would follow us. Now, I mean, I've got to admit, for some reason, you've been one of the best audiences that God could ever hope.